Good day, GCI members, young leaders, and sustainable advocates joining us from around the world. Welcome to GCI Sustain 360 48 Hours Race to Sustainability, a global initiative of the 2026 GCI Sustainability Commission. My name is Sofis Kalamsberg from GCI Suriname, and I have the honor of serving as the 2026 GCI Vice President assigned to America. Through GCI Sustain 360, members and organizations across the world are coming together to learn, to take action, and create meaningful impact around of the most urgent sustainability challenges facing our communities. As part of the 48 Race to Sustainability, we are engaging with experts and others to share their knowledge, practical experience, and also solutions that can help young leaders to translate sustainability into meaningful action. Today, we are focusing on the theme water and water security. Our topic for today is water security in a changing climate, protecting our most vital resource. I think that's a topic that speaks for itself, but water sustained communities, economies, industries, and natural ecosystems. Yet, water resources around the world are facing increased pressure from climate change, population growth, pollution, and so many other things. Water security is not only an environmental issue. Today, we will explore how organizations can better understand water related risk, manage their impacts, strengthen water stewardship, and how you can contribute to a more resilient water system. It is my pleasure to welcome today's guest, Alua Suleimanova. Alua is the Global Sustainability Lead at Marvel Technology, where she helps advance the company's environmental sustainability strategy across global operation, and she also supplies supply chain and products. Her work spans climate strategy, water stewardship, supply chain sustainability, product sustainability, reporting, data system, and corporate governance. She also represents Marvel in key industries initiatives, and she brings extensive international expertise across the technology sector, consulting, research, and international development. Alua, thank you for joining us today and welcome to the GCI Sustain 360 48 Hours Race to Sustainability.
Thank you, Zaviska, and hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
I've introduced you, and we know that you will bring value to this conversation. So let's jump into it. And I have one question to start this conversation. How would you explain water security to a general audience?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first of all, water is probably one of the most critical resources on Earth. No living species, no organization can operate and live without water. And so water security is really about the ability of people, communities, businesses, and natural ecosystems to have reliable access to safe, clean water, and not just in the short term, but also in the long term as well. And I think what makes water security particularly very important is that it's not just about physical access to water resources, but it's also about water quality, whether communities can access it affordably and equitably, and also whether natural ecosystems can potentially absorb and mitigate any water-related risks and disruptions such as droughts, floods, pollution, changing rainfall patterns, and so on. And I think a very important aspect of water is that it's fundamentally local and context specific. We know that carbon emissions, for example, have a potential to contribute to climate change regardless of where they occur, but water challenges always depend on local context, local water basin, and local geography. And so withdrawing the same amount of water from a water abundant region would have very different consequences compared to doing that in a more drought-prone or water-stressed basin. So it's always important to remember about that context. And I think finally, water security is also about resilience and balance, ensuring that, again, communities, businesses, industry, agriculture, and nature can all meet its current water needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their water needs as well. And I think especially in the context of climate change, we're seeing an increase in frequency and severity of some of those water impacts, such as droughts and floods in many parts of the world. And so building that resilience and adaptive capacity for systems, not just to bounce back, but to bounce forward, is really becoming very important.
No, that was well explained. And I do need to say what I'm getting from that is that water security is much more than just having enough water. It really involves quality, but access, and also a system that we can rely on when it comes to water security. So the question that a lot of people currently have is, how is climate change affecting water security?
Absolutely. There is a common saying in the water community that if climate change is the shark, then water is its teeth, because climate change often manifests itself through water-related risks, such as drought, not enough water, or flooding, too much water. And so we already know that climate change has a potential to intensify the global water cycle. So in some cases, it may mean more frequent and prolonged droughts and increasing water scarcity, but in other, it's the opposite. Maybe it leads to heavy rainfall, flooding, stormwater challenges. And so we're already seeing those water-related impacts as a result of climate change in different parts of the world. And so I think for organizations, specifically climate-related water risks really becoming particularly important. And so one is physical water scarcity that we already talked about, especially for operations that are located in inherently water-stressed water basins. But too much water is also a problem because it can damage infrastructure, equipment, interrupt transportation, which is particularly important for port cities, for example, that are kind of important logistics hubs, energy systems, production, and lead to different business disruptions that ultimately impact revenue and have significant financial impacts. And I think one last maybe aspect I want to talk a little bit is the supply chain dimension, because the organization itself may operate its own facilities in fairly water secure locations, but at the same time, it may experience many water risks upstream, mainly in its supply chain, especially if supply chain is concentrated or only a few specialized suppliers are critical to the business. And I think last but not least, obviously, regulatory, reputational, and community-related water risks also need to be taken into account, because often what we're seeing is cascading impact. It may start with water stress, but then it ultimately would affect local communities that are other important water users. In the watershed regulatory aspects, whether there is fair water allocation, what does the water rights situation look like in that basin, and ultimately if there is enough water to support kind of wider community relying on that water resource.
No, so as you said, that's a new saying for me. So if climate change is the shark, then water are the teeth. And I can now see how that really manifests in our not just day to day, not only in our communities and our ecosystems, but also in organizations and businesses, as you explained. So let us now move closer to your area of work and explore how businesses should understand water. Why should organizations understand their water related risk?
Sure. Yeah, I think for organizations, water related risk is not only about sustainability, right? So managing its environmental impacts, but it's really about business resilience and continuity. Almost every organization directly depends on water, either through direct operations or supply chain, as I managed energy, procurement, raw materials, people, infrastructure. So it's really important. And so I think one of the most kind of critical considerations here is that water risk, as I mentioned, is location specific. So conducting a site level water risk assessment is really important to get that level of granularity and understanding what's actually happening in the location of each specific facility, whether it's, again, in direct operations or in the supply chain. And so water risk can really affect business continuity in several different ways. As I mentioned before, physical risks can manifest themselves in the context of drought, for example, which naturally constrains water availability and may lead to restrictions on industrial water use. Flooding and extreme rainfall can damage facilities, infrastructure, disrupt transportation, utilities, and again lead to business interruptions. Poor water quality, we talked a bit about water quality before, can also increase, for example, wastewater treatment requirements, right? Or lead to some additional cost that an organization has to incur to make existing water resources suitable for its operations. And again, as I mentioned in kind of the last point, I think it's really important to look beyond your four walls and really understanding what's happening upstream of your operations, engaging your suppliers, engaging your sub-suppliers, and really understanding what those water risks may look like across the entire value chain.
Okay, thank you for sharing those insights. So listening to you, what I'm realizing is that businesses, for them to ensure continuity, they need to begin somewhere. They need to focus on things that are related to water risk from your perspective. Beyond looking, they have to look beyond their four walls. But if you would say they have to start here, where would you say they should begin?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's always good to start with more visibility and transparency when it comes to data, right? As the old saying goes, if you don't measure, you cannot manage. And so I think before even understanding what are some of the top risks for an organization, it's important to start with collecting water data at a site level, engaging your own facility managers or leads of different sites, engaging your suppliers, understanding what data might be available to you as so-called actual data, meter data, which data you may want to estimate based on square footage, for example. Some other parameters can kind of more directionally tell you what your water consumption looks like. It's definitely important to conduct kind of local water vulnerability assessment and understand where the water actually comes from, not just learning more about your local water utility, but actually understanding what the primary water source is and conducting so-called primary source vulnerability assessment. So you can, again, take that more holistic basin level and context level approach, which is really important because it's organizations usually don't look at water in isolation, but it's really kind of more of a holistic viewpoint. And then the next step would be to map the location of your own facilities, of your supplier facilities against those indicators as it relates to water, such as baseline water stress, drought risk, flooding, groundwater conditions, water quality. And there are many tools that are open source. So those might be the best one to start with. The World Resources Institute, WRI, developed some time ago a very known public tool called Aqueduct Water Risk Atlas that they also try to update regularly to make sure that it's reflective of new developments and modeling. And the WWF also has a water risk filter. And so many companies usually start with those tools so that they can better understand kind of potential hotspots where business dependency and local water challenges overlap. And then as you dig deeper, organizations may want to conduct some kind of more specialized modeling for specific sites after they determined key hotspots. And of course, I think the most important thing is stakeholder engagement and making sure that your facility leads or your suppliers are aware of those risks so you can together work on risk management and mitigation plans and understanding how you're actually going to be coping with those risks, because we see that they're becoming more proliferated in the long term, and how your business can remain to be successful despite those challenges.
Yeah, so those are really great tools for organizations to find out what the risks are for their company when it comes to water. But then also, again, I think it's really important for them to also consider their own impact on their water resources. So, looking at that part now, how do you think that stewardship, water stewardship, is different from simply reducing water use?
Yeah, absolutely. I think effective water stewardship really goes beyond, first of all, the four walls of the organization, as I mentioned. So I think taking this holistic value chain view is really important, but also is much more than simply trying to use less water, right? Water efficiency, of course, is very important, but stewardship, I think, often asks broader questions, how an organization can responsibly manage its water dependencies and impacts within the context of the whole watershed where it operates. And so I think it's definitely important to understand who are other big water users relying on that watersheds, and to start getting to know them and building partnerships. And we're already seeing a lot of examples of that happening in different parts of the world, when companies either within the same industry or even partnering at a cross industry level work with each other to understand how they collectively address those shared water challenges, but also how they can engage local water utilities, water providers, regulators, local communities, right? And kind of taking that holistic basin level approach. And I think also I would kind of describe effective water stewardship as having several key components. So understanding your own water withdrawal, consumption, and discharge. These are really the basics. And quality. If your company is involved in some manufacturing operations as well, assessing watershed level risks. We already talked a little bit about that. Understanding what some of the meaningful water targets you can set, either for your own operations or in partnership with your suppliers, so that you can measure your progress over time and see how some of the mitigation strategies can help you to address your water challenges. Definitely working on water efficiency and reuse where it's possible, managing wastewater responsibly, again, maybe in partnership with your local water utilities, and investing in innovation, and ultimately building that resilience so that you're not just prepared to managing different water availability, but also understanding where that water risk may lie. And so stewardship is really about both water management, supplier engagement, value chain approach, as well as stakeholder engagement and collective action. So this term used a lot, especially in the water community, when you're, again, not just working with your kind of more common business partners, but also engaging other companies operating in the basin, nonprofit organizations, local communities, governments, and so on.
Yeah, so what I'm also really hearing is that a company's relation with water, it really extends beyond its direct operations, and for many organizations, they have like a significant dependency, and impact may exist throughout the whole supply chain of such a company. So when it comes to the supply chain, why are supply chains important in water stewardship?
Yeah, absolutely. I think some companies can have relatively low water use within its own operations. For example, my own company, Marvell Technology, is a good example. We are a fabless semiconductor company, so we focus on product design, but we ultimately outsource manufacturing to third-party suppliers. So within our own operations, we mainly look into water impacts from our offices, R&D labs. We have a few data centers, but our biggest water impact is really upstream, because we work with some of the biggest semiconductor manufacturing companies like foundries, assembly and testing facilities, back-end facilities, substrate producers. So for us, it's really meaningful and important to engage those suppliers, because without that, we wouldn't be telling our full water story. And I think what really distinguishes between a company's direct water footprint and its broader water dependency is if a critical supplier operates in highly water-stressed basin, experiences droughts or flooding, for example, or faces any restrictions on water withdrawals, then the resulting disruption can also affect production and ultimately the company's own ability, right, to deliver products to its customers. So it's not just about social license to operate, but it's really about some serious business and financial impacts. So I think from a business continuity perspective, the fact that the water use occurs outside the company's own operational boundary doesn't make the impact any less significant. In some cases, maybe even more significant. So it definitely has a very strong business case.
Yeah, so as I'm hearing, water exposure can really come from suppliers, manufacturing locations, raw materials, or regions, as you mentioned, we're already that are already experiencing water stress, and this makes visibility across the value chain increasingly important. So when it comes to the whole engaging suppliers on water sustainabilities, what can organizations and what should they realistically expect from especially small suppliers?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's definitely important to engage your suppliers kind of early on the journey, right? So as companies develop their own water inventories, they may want to extend that data collection request to their suppliers. And first of all, understand where they are, understand their baseline, map suppliers' maturity so they can really meet them where they are, right? And set expectations that suppliers can realistically meet. So it really starts through kind of a progressive risk-based approach, right? Rather than immediately expecting every supplier to have a mature and sophisticated water stewardship program. So it's really about partnership and journey together. I think it's also important to start with understanding your business priorities, right? So every company has a list of most critical top, sometimes they call them tier one suppliers. And so it's important to start with those and map their allocations against some of those water indicators that I mentioned, such as water stress, drought, flood risk, and then understand what that engagement with those suppliers should look like more strategically, right? Especially if you find that some of your critical suppliers are located in high-risk watersheds. And this is important because asking hundreds, or some companies may have even thousands of suppliers to complete the same extensive water questionnaire cannot be as meaningful. It can really create a lot of reporting and kind of administrative burden without necessarily generating a useful action. And so I think prioritizing those suppliers and also developing kind of a customized risk mitigation and supplier engagement actions, depending on where your supplier sits in the value chain, how critical it is to your business, what its local water-related conditions, is really important. And I think some companies often focus so much on reporting and disclosures that they're sometimes forgetting about actually doing a direct outreach and meeting their suppliers over Zoom calls or in person if it's possible, and actually have candid conversations and understanding. Do you measure your water withdrawal and consumption? Where does your water come from? How do you monitor water discharge? Have any of your facilities ever experienced some of those water-related risks? And how did your company manage those? Do you have any plans for maintaining operations, right, if those risks become much more severe? And so I think over time, companies can really encourage suppliers to establish their own targets, to work on water efficiency together, maybe even co-investing in water innovation. We're also seeing some really interesting examples of that when companies work with suppliers to make some of those water technology and R&D solutions available. And definitely working together on developing site-level resilience plans. I think it's important not to address those issues in silos. There are many industry specific and cross-industry forums, working groups, consortia that companies can join. So you don't have to engage your suppliers in silo and individually. You can already access a bigger community of companies that are already addressing water issues. And so I think through those consortia, a company can really learn from each other, can potentially connect their suppliers with each other so that they can learn from each other and kind of together mature those water strategies. And definitely lead by example, right? So if you're starting to engage your own suppliers, you probably want to bring your own house in order. And we're also seeing a lot of great examples, companies publishing their lessons learned and best practice case studies through white papers, annual reports, so that they could share their knowledge, share some of the maybe barriers they faced and how they overcame them, some opportunities, gaps. So their suppliers, but also their peers and customers potentially can learn from those best practice industry examples.
Well, thank you for sharing. So we have talked about water security, and by now we understand that it's more than just having enough water, but also about water stewardship that goes beyond the operations of a company and how it impacts them. You mentioned that it's a very common and popular saying that we cannot manage things if we don't measure them. Let us look at the role of data, measurement, and governance when it comes to water. You mentioned some tools that are there for companies to use. What should organizations measure when they are tracking water performance?
Yeah, I think at a basic level, organizations definitely should, at a minimum, measure water withdrawal, water consumption, and water discharge. These are really fundamentals of a water inventory. Because each of these parameters tell us different things about our water use. So water withdrawal is really about how much water was taken from a primary source. Water consumption reflects the portion of water that hasn't been returned to the original water system, right? So was consumed in operations. And discharge helps to understand what happens to water after it has been used, right? How much water could be treated and returned back, or and so I think where relevant, companies should also track the primary source of water, as I mentioned. So working with your local water utility can really help. Many local water utilities have their own water management plans, risk reports, and so those could be definitely great sources. Water quality is definitely an important parameter, and also the amount of water that could be either reused or recycled. Again, talking back about the water efficiency. And I think adding local context and location is really important. So a company ideally would also report that it consumes, for example, X cubic meters of water annually, but also kind of provide more context what happens actually to that water basin, and if it's maybe stress prone, right, water stress basin, what the company is doing to address those water challenges. Again, maybe through some of those partnerships with other companies, nonprofit organizations, and local communities. And I think what's also important is to understand what are some of the community related impacts. I think it's more kind of a novel topic, but especially in sort of my field, I think there is more and more scrutiny around data center expansion, right? So local communities really want to understand what are some of those business plans look like, how they're essentially environment may be affected, right, by that very rapid proliferation of data centers and AI infrastructure. And I think working with your local communities and identifying and measuring some of those metrics, so you know how your operations impact those that also rely on the same water resource, is really important. And so I think as water programs generally mature, measurement can also extend beyond the company's own footprint. I already mentioned supplier engagement could be really important here. And I think ultimately good water measurement should help companies to answer kind of key questions. How much water are we already using, right, and affecting? Where is that happening? What does that mean in terms of the local watershed context, right? And the goal is not just simply generate more metrics and more Excel spreadsheets, but it's really to generate information that is decision useful, right? So companies can act on some of those water risks and address those impacts appropriately.
So to give more clarity on that, because as you mentioned, it's not just about having more and more and more targets. And one thing that I'm realizing is that the local context is really important when evaluating water performance. How can organizations set meaningful water targets that also reflects the local water conditions?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think this is really important to take into account those local water conditions, because water is a fundamentally local resource, right? So no single kind of global reduction target can be useful for driving efficiency, but it may not direct action towards the places where it really matters most. I think it's really important to work with your baseline data, right, and understand what some of your hotspots are. In the US, especially, there was like a whole, I think, new wave of more and more companies setting so-called water positive targets, committing not just to reducing water, increasing water efficiency, but also giving back more water than they would draw. But these targets may not be sort of kind of universally relevant to all organizations. And what I think we've been seeing in the past few years is that as companies start setting those targets, they immediately want to aim at water positive. But maybe that's more of an aspirational kind of direction they might be heading towards. But maybe they should really start with some of the more fundamental action items, such as setting water reduction targets, water efficiency targets, some of those supplier water targets, and gradually moving towards water positive, kind of as they mature their programs. And so I think really, first of all, overlaying kind of your water information with your own facilities can really provide that kind of more holistic picture, so that you're understanding how much water is actually being used at different sites, and whether the target you're trying to set would address issues and challenges related to that specific location, right, and to your facility. And so I think this is where approach such as contextual and so-called science-based water targets become particularly valuable. And so rather than asking questions, how much water can my company reduce, right? We can also ask, what does this particularly watershed need, right? And what target I may want to set so that it truly represents kind of a appropriate contribution towards that holistic need. And that shifts, I think, the perspective from target setting from an internally defined kind of corporate exercise towards a more informed environmental kind of and social context that is inherent to any water basin.
You use a term that I'm really interested in, and I think the people listening today too. Water positive targets. What are those?
Yeah, absolutely. So water positive means that the company is not just focuses on reducing water, right? So in the beginning, and we're talking about probably some decades ago when companies started addressing their water risks for the first time, maybe they would set a 30% reduction target or 50% water efficiency target. But now that we're facing kind of more serious water challenges, also in the context of climate change, companies started to think what we can do for that whole water basin, really looking beyond our own facility. And so water positive is really about essentially looking into some of the feasible projects and innovation, maybe infrastructure development that companies can invest into that can benefit that whole watershed. And so many big data center companies, for example, headquartered in the US, but they really have a global water footprint, they would work with nonprofit organizations startup, water utilities, water technology companies to identify projects that would essentially contribute to some kind of water risk alleviation in basins where they operate. As a way of example, the WWF, for example, or the Nature Conservancy, TNC, may already work with some local water project developers in certain basins, but using funding from some of those bigger companies that do have big operations in those basins, they can expand those projects. They can spearhead new projects, right? They can engage more water partners kind of in those conversations. And so it's not just about one company investing in one project at a certain watershed, but the whole kind of water user community can form around that water basin. And so data center companies can either partner with each other or can partner with their suppliers, can partner even with non-tech companies, and really understanding what needs to happen. Maybe it's about wetland restoration, right? Or forest resource protection, because we know that water is such a, I think, kind of almost like a connected tissue, right? And so definitely ecological restoration can positively impact water resources. Or maybe it's more about infrastructure, because if you have water abundance, but you have really poor water infrastructure in terms of maybe aging dams or leaking pipes, right? That doesn't really address your water challenge. And so I think taking that holistic view and understanding, do we need to make our watersheds healthier and invest into some of those nature-based solutions, or do we need to focus on infrastructure or maybe regulations, or work with local water utilities and understanding how they could continue innovating, right, and providing water to all those kind of increasing water users. So I think, water positive is really about that, giving back water, but looking at possibilities beyond your four walls and really engaging other stakeholders in the water basin.
Thank you for sharing that, and especially introducing this term to us now here today during the 48 hours race of sustainability. So there are a lot of partners in all of this, and there are two which are government and communities that are also really important. From your perspective, how can leaders contribute, but also how can communities participate?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's really important to, I think for businesses to understand that local context, right? And basically start getting to know your local communities. Those could be smaller water users, right? Or those could be residents, could be businesses, agriculture partners, utilities that are operating in that water basins. Because again, as I mentioned, water challenges are highly location specific. And so one community may struggle with access to safe drinking water, right? But another may deal with groundwater depletion, another with flooding, aging infrastructure, or deteriorating water quality. And so I think understanding those issues at the kind of granular level can really help businesses engage local stakeholders appropriately and to understand what the most important challenges actually are, and where some of those corporate resources and investments and expertise can really add meaningful value. And depending on that context, companies can contribute through investments in some of those water projects. As I mentioned, it's becoming really common in support of water positive targets. Those could be watershed restoration, right, groundwater recharge projects, water quality projects, but also water access and sanitation, because we know that in some parts of the world, local communities may not have that affordable access, right, or need to travel really far from where they live to access clean water. Water infrastructure improvements may need to happen, but also not forgetting about risk aspects of water, flood resilience, for example, or how to cope with maybe heavier rainfall patterns, right? And so I think this can all contribute technical expertise, data, right? We were talked about data funding, because maybe local communities may not have those resources kind of available to them internally, but corporations can help financially to develop and mature some of those projects. So it's, I think, really brings that convening power, and community participation is absolutely critical. No company should invest in those projects in silos, right? It's definitely important to make communities part of that conversation, that decision. And so I think local stakeholders often understand their water challenges much better, right? Because they live there, they understand historical context, practical constraints. They might be more familiar with local water regulation that varies quite significantly across the jurisdictions. And so if communities are really involved in helping companies to identify those priorities, designing solutions, evaluating outcomes, then projects much more likely to address genuine needs and remain effective over the long term.
Yes, indeed, communities really should be part of identifying the problem and shaping solutions. But then it's also, on the other hand, a responsibility of leaders and business to provide the tools to eventually come to the solutions. And for organizations such as Junior Chamber International, GCI, it creates an opportunity to connect different stakeholders around local water challenges. So before we conclude, what is a practical step you think an organization can take to strengthen their approach to watership? And if there is anything that young persons today can take from this session, what would it be?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think for any organization, it's really important to start with kind of some of the water stewardship fundamentals, right? So really understanding your own water footprint and your local context, understanding where does your company use water exactly, right? What does it look like at a site level? How much water is being withdrawn, consumed, or discharged? Where it's coming from? Where does it go after use? I think these are really important kind of starting questions. And then, as I mentioned, overlaying some of those water metrics with local context and the location of your facilities is important, because that kind of adds some additional layers. Many companies also develop their own so-called business criticality criteria, right? So maybe some of your facilities, let's say offices, are located in some water-stressed areas, but your own water consumption is actually really small, and maybe most of your employees are not even based on site. Maybe they are working remotely, right? Or maybe it's a very small sales office that doesn't really use a lot of water. And so in that case, you may want to think about target setting or water risk mitigation planning differently compared to whether it would be a manufacturing facility or a big warehouse, for example. And I think it's important to remember that you don't need perfect data in the beginning, right? A very sophisticated global program. It's okay to start with what you have, identifying your highest risk locations first, identifying some of your hotspots, focusing your efforts where you think they can really make the greatest difference. And over time, sharing some of those lessons learned with your suppliers, engaging them in your kind of water stewardship journey, understand how you can work together and some of that target setting, and what partnerships you can develop in the water local watershed. So it's really more of a gradual journey. I think that's really important for water. And I think for young leaders, I think the message I would leave is, I think, important to remember that water is ultimately about connection. It really connects so many different natural systems, climate, food, energy, health, economic development, human well-being. Again, no human being, living species, or organization can survive without water. And so many of those impacts of climate change, as I mentioned, are being experienced through water. So really kind of trying to appreciate that holistic picture in case some of maybe of the members are interested potentially to have career in water, right? You don't just have to become a water engineer. There are so many more career paths that are available as a result. But I also want to emphasize that it's not just about risk. It really has a tremendous opportunity for innovation, collaboration, and leadership and governance. And so I think the next generation of leaders really has a lot of opportunities to rethink how we design some of those water systems, how we think about cities, right, technology, system restoration. There's some really innovative, cool work is happening around wastewater treatment and management, zero liquid discharge. Definitely AI, I think, is much becoming really important in the kind of water story. And I think definitely would encourage young leaders to remember that water doesn't follow organizational or political boundaries, right? No river belongs to one company, one industry, or sometimes even one country. And so I think protecting it really requires us to think beyond those boundaries and kind of our own individual footprints or individual organizational footprints, and recognizing that's a shared dependence of the same resource. And I think it can start even with curiosity, where your water comes from, right? Even if you're not working in the water space professionally, understanding who and what shares that water with you, how you yourself using water, right? And so water security is kind of a shared challenge, but also a shared opportunity and shared responsibility.
Aluat, thank you so much for sharing your valuable knowledge, your experience, but also your perspective with the GCI global community. Today's conversation has shown us that water security is not only about conserving water. It's also about understanding how communities, businesses, supply chains, and ecosystems depend on this resource. And we're also reminded that water is a shared resource. As you just said, it's about connection. No organization can address water security by their own or alone. And meaningful progress really requires collaboration between businesses, communities, government experts, civil society. And for GCI members and young leaders, there's an important role to play in creating these connections and encouraging practical local action. But also, you shared with us that it's today on us, the future leaders, to invest in knowing how we can work on water-related risk. And you have shared so much with us today, and we're very grateful on behalf of Junior Chamber International and the 2026 GCI Sustainability Commission. Thank you once again for sharing your knowledge. And for everyone here today, thank you for joining us for this interview that is part of the GCI Sustain 360 48 Hours Race to Sustainability. I'm Sofis Kalamsberg from GCI Suriname. Until our next session. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Zaviska, and thanks everyone.